Everyone to CGHE seminar number 144 with the exciting topic of the global geopolitics of science. Global science has grown immensely in the last 2 decades, for the most part supported by governments and universities, which have fostered cooperation across borders between researchers, but above all driven by the cooperation of the scientists themselves. And within global science, by far the biggest single collaboration is between scientists from the United States and scientists from China. In 2018, they co-produced 55,382 papers, which is by far the biggest nation-to-nation collaboration in world science. Now, this collaboration is in some jeopardy amid the rapid escalation of tensions between US and China, driven, I think, in the first instance by a bipartisan drive in the US to reassert global leadership, not least in science and technology. Researchers in China who were yesterday welcome collaborators in the United States now seem to be under some suspicion. The US government is also putting pressure on its allies in the UK and Europe and Australia and other countries to adopt a more critical or hostile attitude to cooperation with China in science and technology. And all of this is happening amid a global pandemic in which cooperation in relation to COVID-19 between scientists in the US and China and the rest of the world has taken on a life and death importance. Now, to discuss this topic today, we have with us Jenny Lee from the United States, who's also a visiting scholar in Cape Town in South Africa, where I think she might be currently speaking from. Brendan Cantwell from Michigan State University in the United States, and Wen Wen, who's from Tsinghua and is currently at Harvard. I'll introduce the 3 speakers properly in a moment, but let me just take you through the web protocols. Now, please remember that this Zoom webinar is being recorded and it will be made available in the next 48 hours or so on the CGHE website. We also make available the chat from the webinar, which will probably go up first. So your wise words in the chat will be recorded. Now, please keep yourself muted during the webinar unless you've been asked to speak or when you get to the point of asking a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but we'd like you to turn it on when you ask a question. We recommend using the speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, we suggest you use the chat function. You write out your question before you are asked to speak. That way we can identify who's asking what kinds of questions and we can ensure a good spread of questioners. Now, at the end of the presentation, we move to the question and answer session. And if your question is selected, you'll be invited to ask it yourself directly. When you're invited to ask the question, please unmute yourself, most important, switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. Well, at this point, it's my delight to move to the business part of the webinar. Our first speaker is Jenny Lee, and Jenny Lee, to some extent, has kickstarted the discussion at today's webinar by publishing a number of papers on the question of US-China cooperation in research and science. Jenny is a professor of higher education in the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona. And as I said a moment ago, she's also a visiting scholar at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She works on a whole range of issues in higher education studies, but she's done a number of studies of science and research in recent years. Jenny, over to you. You have 10 minutes and then we'll go to Brendan and then Wen Wen.
All right, can everyone see me? Am I on the speaker view?
We can see you.
Okay. All right. I'll just go ahead and start talking.
Please do.
Okay. So thanks, Simon, for the introduction and the opportunity. So to begin, I'm just going to start by saying that the global science system is not very global at all. It is highly shaped by highly resourced nations. It's already been well discussed in Simon's introduction in the website. If we talk about global science, we have to talk about the US and China, the two largest producers of scientific knowledge, the two largest research collaborators in the world, and the two countries account for over half of the world's scientific articles over the past 10 years. So before I delve into the latest research findings, which include how scientists are addressing COVID-19 towards a global common good, it's also important to contextualize the prevailing challenges in the global science system. There are clear trends by income category. High and upper middle income countries produce the large majority of S&E, science and engineering publications, and this is in stark contrast to lower middle income economies like India, Indonesia, Pakistan, and similar countries in this bracket that produce less than 10% of the world's share of scientific research. And despite the long-standing dominance of the US, UK, Germany, Japan, the publication growth rate among high-income countries has been minimal. For some of these countries, it has actually been declining. But among the upper middle income countries, we've seen a steady rise. Besides China, the biggest increases over the past 10 years has been India, Iran, and Russia. In other words, we're seeing more players as national scientific systems develop. International collaboration is also on the rise. While domestically produced research has benefited global society, international collaborations are especially important for lesser resource countries. The global scientific system has to be understood in relation to the importance that international ties play in enabling resources to be pooled and maximally exploited in ways that national research might be limited. However, center-periphery relationships aren't always equal, they're not always beneficial, and international collaborations may reflect national competitive agendas or interests that don't always align with the global public good. For such reasons, there is no perfect indicator of global science. And I also contend that global science is not just the production of scientific knowledge, but also access and participation in it. Besides the fewer resources to conduct research, lower income countries are often on the scientific periphery, and they've long been disadvantaged by the unaffordability of journal subscriptions known as information famine. Global science has also long been subject to Western control and bias. While English is the lingua franca of science, it is only the third most spoken language on the planet. And although a third of all scholarly journals are being published in languages other than English, they're excluded from prestigious journal indexes such as the prominent Science Citation Index. Research that is thus exported for global English-speaking audiences may be compromised and offer less value to the originating research communities. That's why, thus far, I believe the biggest shift that will impact the scientific knowledge system is China's researcher evaluation reform, which was announced earlier this year. China's ministries issued a joint announcement to halt any promotional recruitment on the sole basis of SCI publication or citation counts. This would allow the country's research to more directly address China's concerns within China's context. This policy is expected to lead to a significant decline in Chinese publications in English language journals and an increase in domestic Chinese journals. China's reform may have a negative impact on international collaboration as well. There have been various interpretations and commentaries on this reform, but my take is that China's reform more broadly challenges a global system that has long been dominated by the West. Given the unusually powerful role of China in the world's scientific research production, China's steps, reform measures, could potentially challenge the long-dominated Western core of global science. While this move might be seen as a sudden reflex to the latest international tensions, calls to cease China's so-called SCI worship began as early as 2016, stemming from domestic worries about the country's hyper-focus on quantitative SCI indicators over societal value. This move was partly in response to a more globally shared concern about governmental and university funds being used towards international publishers based mostly in Western Europe and the US, and then paying them again to access their own scientific articles at full price. This cost scheme places lower income countries even more on the scientific periphery. So, to the latest research results. What happens when there's a global crisis, when we presume that scientific collaboration is most necessary? While Professor Brennan Cantwell and Professor Wen Wen will review the geopolitical specifics about the US and China, one might reasonably predict a significant decline in international research collaborations, particularly among the two countries. A rise in nationalism throughout the world would also suggest there's more single country publications overall. However, in a series of bibliometric studies conducted with John Hout, we found the opposite. First, the percentage of international collaborations have been increasing worldwide over the past 5 years. How do we explain this? The benefits of international collaboration are indisputable in increasing overall quality and impact. For low-income countries, international collaboration is vital in mobilizing resources, developing scientific capacity and output, while higher income countries can access specimens and data, extend global networks and audiences, and attract research labor. Smaller national scientific systems tend not to allow for high levels of specialization, making international collaboration especially vital, which also explains the next major finding. Second, the extent of international collaboration on COVID-19 is higher than recent years. It's higher than before the global crisis, and it's higher than non-COVID-19 research during the same 2020 timeframe. This is especially true for less wealthy countries and those with higher COVID-19 cases. Again, how do we explain this? The unprecedented nature and novelty of COVID-19 may further explain the overall international collaboration increase. Scarce resources push researchers to work together. In the case of COVID-19, limited available specimens during the early part of this year and the cost to generate and analyze the data, combined with the urgency of addressing the global health crisis, helps to explain the significantly increased rate of internationally produced COVID-19 research worldwide. And countries with more cases were generally more inclined and more sought after to collaborate. We also found that amongst the high research producing countries, they were on average collaborating with more countries per article on COVID-19 compared to before the pandemic. In other words, scientists are working across borders to addressing the new coronavirus more internationally. Well, what about the US and China? Our research findings indicate that the two nations are conducting the most COVID-19 research and continue to collaborate more with each other than with any other country. In fact, their rate of collaboration increased 5% over their rate even prior to the pandemic. And what this tells us is that scientists are coming together in addressing a global crisis, even despite international tensions. This growth in collaboration, despite US-China strains, actually predates the pandemic. As we found, the US co-authorship pattern between US and China has been steadily rising over the past 5 years. My findings with John Hout debunked this so-called China threat. We found that when excluding publications with authors affiliated with Chinese institutions, US publications go down. Put it another way, scientific collaboration across national borders is a positive sum endeavor, despite political attempts to frame cooperation with China as being zero-sum. While US governmental hearings and legislative proposals depict China and all its nationals as dependent upon or stealing from the US, in our research, we find the opposite. For the time being, China is leading in US-China co-authored studies. They are leading as first authors, they are leading in funding. What this pattern will look like once China's research evaluation reform is in full effect is, however, uncertain. In conclusion, in times of global crisis, it is imperative that scientists are able to collaborate and share data. Our research suggests that this is happening. Although scientists, international networks, and global science as a whole are shaped by resources, the restrictions and incentives that national governments provide, scientific research is not determined by national interests or policies alone. International collaboration also occurs by the extent to which scientists respond. Right now, US and Chinese scientists are exercising agency in where and with whom they publish. While we do not know how much more research could have been conducted if the two countries were on friendlier terms, science for now does seem to not have to follow political agendas. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Jenny. And that's some good news there, I think, on the whole. A positive story about scientific agency proceeding regardless of the geopolitics. But as you say, we don't know what would have happened if there'd been no geopolitical tensions. Our next speaker, Brendan Campbell. Brendan is Associate Professor in the Department of Educational Administration and at Michigan State University. And he's one of the three editors-in-chief of the journal Higher Education. A valued colleague, Brendan, we share that role. Brendan speaks as a higher education expert on many topics, but he's particularly known for his work on the political economy of higher education. Brendan.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me today. I'm going to talk about the geopolitics as I see them from the point of view of the United States. And of course, that means that we begin with the Trump administration. The administration's vulgar, racist, and nationalist approach to almost everything, including immigration, trade, and education and science, captures all of our attention. Of course, what Trump does matters a good deal, and we should pay attention to it. But I want to focus mostly on what I call the base layer of China skepticism within the US government and political and security establishment. It's likely, although by no means certain, that Trump will not be president next year. But the US-China Cold War and its implications for higher education will continue under a new administration. This base layer is different from the Trump layer. The base layer is not just racist white nationalism and mindless protectionism. I want to be a little bit cautious about about conclusively analyzing what I call the base layer of China skepticism, because I'm not a US-China relations or US foreign policy expert. Still, I think it consists of at least two streams. The first is a conflict that is endemic to the international order. China now rivals US power. It is likely, perhaps inevitable, that a burgeoning superpower would lead to tension. The second is a sense of American exceptionalism, or the idea that the United States has a moral and political obligation to take a leadership role in global affairs. Actions by the Chinese government and by Chinese entities also contribute to the brewing Cold War. This is not a one-sided affair, even if I focus my comments on the US. Higher education in academic science and technology has emerged as a clear front in the US-China Cold War. In the US, we have numerous examples of how this Cold War is progressing. Some include bluntly racist efforts, such as Trump's attempt to ban international students and limits to Chinese students' access to the country, and language from lawmakers like Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton, who has made Chinese exclusion a top issue. But the base layer also shows how vital academic science and technology are to this Cold War. FBI Director Christopher Wray has identified intellectual property theft as the most significant security threat facing the country. The bipartisan legislation, including the Endless Frontiers Act, which would orient the U.S. National Science Foundation to defense and security interests, and the Confucius Act, which would dramatically limit the scope for Confucius Institutes to operate in the U.S., have both been introduced in the past few months. Why have higher education and academic science become active fronts in the Cold War? It's not entirely clear to me, but I think there are a few possible reasons. It could partly be because US universities have long been engaged in extensive defense research. It could partly be because this is a clear and frequent line of contact between US persons and Chinese persons, education is in science, through students and research collaborations. And so this contact has become a natural fault line. It could also be because China's strategy of enhancing its scientific and research development capacity through a combination of a domestic investment, policy incentives, and international engagement has worked. The speed of development of Chinese higher education and academic science is breathtaking. Just as in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the United States established a new global template for universities by reimagining the European university. China might be reimagining the American university for a new global template by the mid to late 21st century. The Chinese model would likely be globally interconnected, but it would be less liberal and more obviously aligned with state goals. I think in some sense, Developments like the Endless Frontiers Act are a return to Cold War style policy and away from a neoliberal policy approach to US higher education. I think it also reflects the US adopting a stance towards higher education that is more similar to the one held by China. Reorientation requires retheorization. To the extent that we see a genuine rivalry between the future of the global higher education and science system, I propose that we need to retheorize how we think about the global order of higher education. For decades, the center-periphery model was the primary framework for understanding the political dynamics of international higher education. The intellectual genealogy of the center-periphery model includes structural Marxist approaches such as dependency and world systems theories, which describe capitalist production as unbundled geographically, with some countries involved in capital-intensive value-added production and others in raw material extraction. Universities in the center, primarily research institutions in the global north, anchor higher education by generating knowledge and establishing normative standards upon which universities in the periphery, mostly non-research institutions and those in the global south, depend. The center-periphery model conjures the image of a solar system-like organization to the global sector. In such a model, fixed orbital paths define the center, and the center and the periphery cannot change. Instead, I propose that we think about global higher education and the geopolitics of it as a multipolar, polycentric system. Global higher education includes many spatial concentrations of prestigious institutions and resources. The global higher education system is trilateral with clusters in East Asia, Europe, and North America. Within this multipolar framework, there are multiple centers and status concentrations. The European education area is a center, and within it, there are national and regional global centers. Within Europe, the Oxford universities may be the center of university education, and Zurich may constitute a center for scientific research. Similar patterns exist for East Asia and North America, and centers exist outside the trilateral poles. In Brazil, the University of Sao Paulo is a center for academic science in Latin America. Iran is an emerging center for Central Asia. Russian universities have consolidated meaningful regional roles. By understanding the organization of global higher education and academic science as multipolar and polycentric, we avoid notions of a solar system like center-periphery. Asymmetrically networked with growing, so this multipolar system we should think of as asymmetrically networked with growing regional circuits. The several poles and centers of the global higher education system interact with each other. They are networked. Networking occurs through multiple mechanisms: mobility and the circulation of students and academics, formal partnerships, programmatic and research collaborations, weak and episodic links through association meetings, conferences, and other fora. These are all examples. Networks are often represented horizontally. Global higher education networks are not flat, but rather asymmetric, with actors occupying different positions of centrality and power. It's also true that growing regional centers operate outside of established patterns of global dependency, but such networks may reflect local asymmetries. As Jenny clearly established, the United States and China are the largest and most influential countries when it comes to global science and higher education. Extensive collaboration between these countries propels the global science system. The world benefits from engagement between the US and China. It would be naive to assume that such engagement could be or will be conflict-free. The interest of both countries to achieve and maintain technological and economic superiority and extend their influence globally means that some level of rivalry is unavoidable, I think. But a multipolar, polycentric global science system, even an asymmetrically networked one, also means that a scientific Cold War is unlikely to succeed in isolating one or the other countries from the global science system. Capacity is too distributed and not dependent on any single country. Here's where I think maybe my view differs a little bit from Jenny's. Even the two overwhelmingly leading countries for the United States and China cannot end the worldwide system. It doesn't mean that the global academic system cannot be diminished or changed, of course, or reduced, but I think it will endure even if one of those countries were sidelined, and I think it's almost impossible to sideline one of those countries. So the ultimate consequence of the scientific front of the US-China Cold War could be the making of closed-off nationalist universities. If we think of the nationalist university as a conservatively idealed institution, we might think of it as not a true university. It's fixed, it's static. It's like a bronze statue atop a marble pedestal. It's singular, fixed in place, and seemingly stable, but also ultimately useless and vulnerable to collapse. Full exchange of ideas and debate require that universities are open to people with different experiences, perspectives, and knowledge. This requires that universities provide access inclusively within their countries and engage with students and academics across borders. Barriers to international migration, such as those favored by Trump and other nationalist leaders, as well as censorship and internet firewalls, such as those implemented in China, limit the extent that makes the university an international institution. Diversity and exchange is the university's lifeblood. In my view, the scientific front of the US-China Cold War is ultimately counterproductive for both countries and for the world. Some conflict between these powers is probably inevitable, but it needs to be managed without building too many barriers to scientific and academic exchange, because those barriers could ultimately result in inward-looking universities and a weaker global science system overall. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Brendan, for that compelling analysis. And it's interesting to see how scientific nationalism generates this sort of geopolitical convergence around norms of scientific nationalism. So you get the two powers starting to behave more like each other. But I think your prognosis is generally optimistic. That as was Jenny's, that you think that the interdependency, the level of mutual engagement, and the volume of mobility and cooperation is such that it's not easy to undo altogether or to separate any single national science system off from the global one. At this point, I think we should bring in Wen Wen. Welcome, Wen, and good to have you on the show. Wen is a valued colleague also, and currently an associate professor in higher education at Tsinghua in the Institute of Education. She's also vice director of the University Center for Asian Studies, and currently she's a Fulbright scholar at Harvard University. Wen.
Good morning from Boston. Thanks, Simon, for having me in this webinar. I am currently stranded in the US, partly because of the COVID-19 pandemic, partly because of the geopolitical tension between the US and China. So I myself, it's a good example of how the new geopolitics of science will influence individual researchers. The topic of my talk today is Chinese research universities and the new geopolitics of science. Following Jenny and Brandon's talk, my talk will mainly address what the status quo of China's international collaboration is and how Chinese research universities will respond to the new geopolitics of science. To be more specifically, how to find a balance between scientific globalism and the scientific nationalism. I will use publication data as a metric to evaluate the scientific output, and my analysis in the talk will be based on some of the bibliometric evidence from CNKI, which is the China National Knowledge Infrastructure, which is the biggest database of Chinese publication, and Web of Science, which is one of the major database for English publications. Before mapping the status quo of China's scientific output, there's some background we need to know about China's research universities and the science management system. So first, almost all the research universities in China are public universities. So while the term public has different connotations in China and in the US, and even in Chinese context, the concept itself has been changed over time. The term public has several fundamental aspects. Number one is public patronage. And number two is the non-rigorous and non-excludable goods and service provided by research universities. Number three is public interest. Number four is the public accountability. In the Chinese context, China's research universities during the past few years, the public patronage and providing non-frivolous and non-excludable goods and services have been largely mitigated by the neoliberal ideology and new public management. So, however, due to the particular governance of Chinese higher education and its origin from the Soviet Union model in the 1950s and the college model in CCP's liberated areas in 1930s, both models seeking to meet state manpower and industrial technological goals. So the third and the fourth aspect of public, which refers to public interest and public accountability, largely remained and in today's China's research universities. And they are also considered to be the advantage of Chinese research universities. And the second background, the second point of the background we have to pay attention to is the Rationaire of higher education internationalization in China, which is mainly driven by domestic politics and the interest of research universities. In Chinese context, for a long time, even today, higher education internationalization is an alternative of modernization discourse and is taken as an approach or a functional tool to achieve the goal of modernizing China's higher education system. So today, the most important agenda in Chinese research universities is to become world-class universities, with the Rationaire of international research collaboration being associated with the logic of learning from or catching up, with the world-class universities in developed countries, rather than projecting soft power in, for example, Belt and Road Initiative countries. And the third thing we have to pay attention is about the management system of China's scientific research. China has a unique higher education governance system. On the one hand, it has a top-down policy control, but on the other hand, it has a kind of decentralized local initiative. So as for international research collaborations, it is mainly operated in a bottom-up way, rather than in a top-down way. Most of the international research collaboration in China occurs at the individual researchers level, or the discipline-based or cross-disciplinary research groups, or at the institutional level, such as universities, institutions, or the labs. Projects that are organized in a top-down way can only be found in the fields of those global issues, such as global climate change, environmental pollution, the biodiversity, etc. Having this background of China's higher education system in mind, I will now turn to some quantitative data to try to map the geopolitics of science in China. Trevor, could you help to share your screen? Thank you. Yeah, the second slide. Okay. Well, in the past few years, there's a rapid increase in English publications in China. Different from many European countries, China has a huge national science system. In the year 2017, there were 6.21 million R&D researchers in China, 360,000 doctoral students in mainland China, with world second top spending on research and development in higher education, right after the United States. Next slide. In total, the volume of Chinese publication is much higher than that of English publication. In the year 2018, the number of articles written in Chinese and published on Chinese journals was more than 1 million, twice that published in English journals. However, by saying that, the number of Chinese publication maintains very stable over the past 10 years. So you would see from from the top line, which is very stable, while English publication increased rapidly since the year 2009. And the second, next slide. The trend was magnificent in China's top research universities. There are 10 top research universities which produced most English publications in China. The top research universities produce twice as much English publication as Chinese publication. The growth rate of English papers was significantly higher than the rate at which the number of Chinese papers declined. So you would say that the lines in the charter on the right hand is much sharper than that of the charter on the left hand. Okay, next slide. And there emerges an integration of the national science system and global science system. China is the third biggest international collaborators of scientific research in the world. According to Xie and Freeman's research, papers authored in China rose from 4% of the scopers count in the year 2000 to 18%. And it also rises to 23%, and this number becomes 35% of all science when papers with at least one Chinese address or name are included, and 45% if all the Chinese publications are included. So that's why Xie and Freeman concludes that China has a huge role in developing the knowledge-based economy. However, the proportion of international collaboration in Chinese top research universities is still lower than other top research universities in the world. Next slide. For example, as Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, and Stanford, all these top research universities has the proportion of internationally co-authored papers above 40%, while most Chinese research universities are at a level of 30% or so. Okay, and the next slide. There is a huge imbalance of international collaboration. Global collaboration between China and foreign countries clumps in distinct patterns of concentrated activity. That is, some countries collaborate more than others. So table 3 and table 4 show that countries that have more co-authorships with Chinese scholars are mainly English countries, English-speaking countries like US, UK, Canada, and Australia, among which US has the overwhelming amount of co-authored papers in STEM, science and technology subjects with China. Germany and Japan are the only non-English speaking countries which have deeply integrated into global science system. Table 4 shows that China collaborates with Taiwan, Singapore, and Japan in social sciences, but there's a less propensity to collaborate with BRI, Belt and Road Initiative countries, which have relatively weak research capacities. So far, there's no solid evidence to showcase that China's political, economic, and cultural influence in Asia have impacted the spatiality of science. Yeah. Next slide. Okay, in addition to the imbalance between collaboration countries, there's also an imbalance in the direction of citations. First, few articles or books written in Chinese are quoted by English articles due to the hegemony of English language in science. And secondly, the citation frequency of Chinese authors' English publication by other countries is much less than that of Chinese authors citing publications from other countries. This is a very long sentence. So if you look at table 5, It clearly shows that China cites US, Canada, France, Germany, and the UK much more frequently than these countries citing China. Citations between China, South Korea, and China, Taiwan are almost equal. So you would say from those countries or regions highlighted in red. Yeah, it's almost I mean, the citation frequency between South Korea and China, Taiwan and China are pretty much the same at the same level. While India is an exception. India cites China more than China cites India. Okay, and the US is of course the center of this global citation network, indirectly linked to all countries in the global network. So only 2 countries are most frequently cited by the United States. They are Canada and the UK, and all other countries cite US much more than US citing them. So it tells us that the formation of an academic center is not only based on language advantages, but also on accumulated reputation and hegemony of knowledge. Knowledge is not objective from a geopolitical perspective. It is embedded in power in the geopolitical tension. Well, to briefly conclude the data part, there exists complex patterns of variations within subsectors in the relationship between China's national and global science system. There are overlaps between China's national system and global science system, but there are also a lot of conflicts and tensions between China's national science system and global science system. And I didn't focus on social sciences in this talk. For social sciences, that's a totally different story, and which makes the picture of China's international collaboration in research more complex and more challenging. Well, as Marginson and I conclude in our collaborated article published in Chinese last year, global science is not a universal container, as its effects are fragmented and uneven. How should Chinese research universities respond to the new geopolitics of science? Well, a simple answer to this question is that it at least partly depends on the large evolution of the global role and influence of Chinese civilization. But to be more specific, in fact, Chinese research universities are not only subject to, but also they are participating and they are forming, they're shaping the geopolitics of science as a superpower in science. So there's still a long way for Chinese research universities to go, given the complex picture, the complex pattern, and the uneven and also the fragmented picture in the international collaboration. I will stop by here because I don't think I have more time, but we can come back and to discuss, some of the topics recurring in the talk later in the discussion session. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Wen. I mean, you've opened up more issues and thank you very much for the data, which I think were very explanatory. Fascinating to see the volume of work done in Chinese, and that's the sense that I don't think most of us didn't have. That there's a large below the top of the iceberg of knowledge in China, which we'd all like to know more about. The webinar, I think, has been really good. I want to start with a question, but we'll then move to our participants. My question is partly picking up some of the things that are being said in the chat. Jenny talked about the more independent course, which the SCI decision suggests that China is now taking. And I think she used the word challenge to the global science system. Brendan talked about the multipolar, polycentric emerging character of the system. Now, it's really in response to those two things that I want to ask my question. What are the prospects, not for China this time, but for other large national systems that are not part of the Europe and North America and Japan traditional scientific alignment? I'm thinking of India, which is now the fourth biggest producer in terms of volume of papers. Iran, which is another large system with a strong focus on physical sciences and engineering. Brazil, South Korea. I mean, what are the prospects of those fairly nationally aligned systems? They build national cooperation very vigorously. What are their prospects of emerging in a stronger role as part of a more polycentric environment? I think that's questions probably to Jenny and to Brendan, but Wen may well want to come in as well.
Well, Simon, I think that's more of an answer than a question in that I agree. When we look at especially the rise of India and Iran in particular, compared to a slight downward trend in Japan, as well as not a huge leap in the US, minimal in the UK, we are seeing more and more players. And tying back to the issue of geopolitics, these are also long-standing relationships, not sudden collaborations as a result of politics, except with COVID-19, I think being an exception to that. So I think in terms of collaboration, it will continue, as well as more and more players. So it's a simple answer just to affirm your question answer.
Thank you very much, Jenny. You quite rightly correct me. I think we best pass straight into the to the participants now. Aki Yanazawa from Tohoku in Japan has the first question.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of the speakers, and it was really fascinating to know that the kind of the global picture of what's going on. And my question is mainly from the Japanese perspectives, what we are thinking about now on the geopolitics. Especially, I also hope that some kind of multipolar type, the balancing will emerge, but I'm a bit I'm not really optimistic so that on that issue. So why it is so? Because I think that the US and China tension is already raising tensions among the surrounding countries, especially like Japan. And for example, our university now becoming cautious to collaborate with the Chinese researchers, although we have a very long relationship with the Chinese academics and the universities, as Wen Wen mentioned. So, and this means that we are facing with the pressure from the US, at least as a voluntary diplomatic efforts to as a allied country with US. Although we also have tried to make a good relationship with China, so that we are already under the influence of the very big geopolitics, and it is very difficult to become kind of an independent body actor to develop the multipolar initiative from us. So I cannot be so optimistic on the idea of the multipolar system. And my question is how the world-class universities or the leading research universities across the country or the international academic community in the world can develop the collaboration network against the emerging so-called regional or some kind of ideological blocks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aki. I think we might ask Brendan to come in because Jenny got the last question.
So it's interesting to hear the diplomatic or the pressure to reduce ties, collaboration with China from the United States. It's not especially surprising. I think that's a major diplomatic effort by the U.S. right now. I think, in fact, Mike Pompeo is in London trying to persuade Boris Johnson to take a harder line on China right now. I think it's an open question how effective that line will be in the long term. I mean, the U.S. government's efforts to sideline Huawei, for example, and European and other governments having contracts with Huawei seems like the results of that are mixed. And I'm not convinced that the United States will be able to sort of cut Huawei out of out of 5G and big government contracts. So it may be that that pressure is coming, but that the long-term effects of that pressure are less. The outcome, we'll only find out over a period of time. When it comes to the major research universities, I think that actually, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think that to the extent that the United States maintains a nationalist stance, both formally in policy and culturally, in creating a sort of hostile environment for people from around the world, that this will accelerate multipolarity of the global science system. If you look at top leading research universities, particularly science and technology, heavily quantitative fields, they're populated very heavily, over 50%, with people from outside of the United States. If the United States closes the door, those people don't go away, right? But they'll either continue to work in their home countries, in China and India largely, or they'll begin to move to third countries, which I think will accelerate this sort of multipolarity of it. In a sense, I think that U.S. dominance is going to be enduring, right? That's been pointed out by all of the speakers, but would always decline. And the speed of that decline is accelerated by a nationalist, protectionist university, the decline isn't prevented by it. That's my general take, but probably didn't fully answer your question.
Thank you very much. And I think that let me just add that it's only 50 years ago that Japan didn't have a intensive research collaboration with mainland China. And at that time, we only had the more collaboration with Taiwan and also the United States, even in the Chinese studies. So I think that I'm really keen about having the very independent and autonomous research collaboration among the academics and universities in order to not to go back to such a kind of a very the age of the Cold War. Thank you.
I think we all agree with that, Aki, and it's very interesting to look at the period of opening up in China after 1978 and the role that Japan played in government and the economy, and also later in the universities and science in that opening up. Japan was China's best partner, best international partner in many respects in that period in terms of intensive activity in encouraging the process of China connecting to the world effectively. So it's potentially an enormously important relationship to everyone, I think, but particularly to the two countries. I'm going to pass at this stage to Miguel Lim, who's got a question, I think, for Wen Wen, because we should bring Wen into the question and answer session. Miguel, can you come in at this point?
Yes. Hello, good afternoon from Manchester. So Miguel Lim from the University of Manchester. So Wen and Jenny, you used bibliometric data in your presentations. Thank you very much, well, to everyone. Can I ask about this change, this policy change away from the SCI? It was interesting. I learned that China's first SCI paper was in 1973. And when some of your data show that there are, well, more than 500,000 probably papers in that range. How fast do you think will these incentives or policies by the Chinese government change researcher practices, given the other investments and policy messages that you mentioned about building world-class universities? So can these incentives go hand in hand? And how soon do you think these incentives away from the SCI will have an effect on actual practices of researchers? Thank you.
Wen, would you like to pick that up?
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the question. And yeah, it was very a recent change. Well, I cannot give an expectation of how soon it will change, but what I have to say is that it is changing, and the best universities in China, like Tsinghua, has already responded to this policy by changing the evaluation criteria of PhD degree holders. So that's a big change. Well, and actually, the policy is not changed suddenly. before this policy was proposed earlier this year, there are already some discussions and the science about that, and Chinese policymakers and also researchers have realized this this reliance on SSSCI orientation, SCI or SSCI evaluation orientation for a long time, and criticized it for a long time. And I think this year, this policy was a big change. But I still think it depends on subjects, disciplines, and also like which level of university you are doing your research. For example, for humanities and social sciences, which I didn't talk much about in my talk, which is also presented a very different story of the STEM disciplines. Most of the best publication in humanities and social sciences in China actually are in Chinese. So for these subjects, the policy is good, and it will definitely add credits for the development of these subjects. However, for some science disciplines like philosophy, physics, mathematics, chemistry, biology, etc. For these disciplines, I don't think China, at this moment or in the short time, will develop a more reliable and more scientific criteria to evaluate the scientific output of these disciplines. So what I mean is that there should be like a kind of balance between, on the one hand, we have to stick to the Chinese characteristics of our research, particularly in social sciences and humanities. But on the other hand, science is global, and the science system is more open than any other society systems. So I think the most challenging thing is to find a balance between science nationalism and the science globalism for China. That's very challenging. And another point I want to add is that Chinese academics have already recognized that in order to grow from good to great in research, systematic change is required to support a truly excellent research culture. So this evaluation policy is only part of this system, but it's not all. So that means there are still more things to do to change the current research culture, like to involve more the changes involve faculty evaluation, reward, and funding structures, and also to change the motivation from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation, and university administration to a model with more autonomy, less government intervention, healthy competition. So there are a lot of things to do, not just this evaluation policy. Yeah.
Mm. Well, it's certainly going to be tested in the next few years, isn't it? You know, the effects of the change. And I feel that in the science literature, in the scientific literature, the factor of cognitive accumulation or curiosity tends to be underplayed often. And literature talks in terms of preferential attachment, you know, that people follow their self-interest and attach themselves to more powerful scientists and so on, and that drives collaboration. I think a lot of collaboration is driven by intellectual curiosity, that people work with each other because their ideas are interesting to each other, and maybe those ideas are new and on the cutting edges and so on. And the best people seem to work that way. I'm not sure whether that drives the whole pattern of collaboration, but it certainly drives a lot of the high quality science. So I guess we'll see if without the SCI incentive in the old form, you know, how much bottom-up cooperation does occur on a continuing basis in the sciences. And I suspect that such as the quality and the volume of quality in science in China and its connection to the existing system, as Brendan said, that it's hard to imagine cooperation not continuing internationally and co-publication not continuing at a high volume. It's just a question of how high, and you know, what changes are going on in other domains. Now, at this point, we best bring in Anwar Ramjohn, who's been waiting patiently. Are you still there, Anwar? Hello, Anwar.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh,
Simon.
good. Thanks, Anwar. Come in, yeah.
Thank you, Simon. I'm from Mauritius, the Institute of Education. And I would like to thank the speakers for their presentation. And my question, I think I have to reformulate it because some of the question which I put initially has been partly answered by the speakers. I will try to reformulate my question, which relates to the initial question itself. So my question is, I draw on what Jenny said, global science is not global at all. And we've seen the presentations today because most of the data are focused on the countries of the Northern Hemisphere, not data coming from the Southern Hemisphere like South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So I heard the word of the multi-scientific globalism, and I think it's Brandon who talked about there is an acceleration of multipolarity of science. So do you think that this COVID-19 has initiated that acceleration of multipolarity of the global science?
Well, we can give that question to any of our speakers, and I think perhaps this is going to have to be the last question because we've just got to just after 3 o'clock and in UK time, and I guess we better make this the last word from everyone. So we could quickly go around the group, each take a minute or so to respond to Anwar's question, but also to close the webinar.
I'll answer very quickly, at least my view of things. So Anwar, there's a paper that's coming out in higher education that looks at the 25 top producing countries. And there were some irregularities based on COVID-19 research. So for example, Italy became amongst the top for obvious reasons given how they were affected. So it's interesting to see that when there is a global crisis, the patterns are not so predictable. So in relation to other epidemics and that have occurred in the past. I think one more thing that I just wanted to comment on, when we talk about global science and national science, I think it is also important to address the intersection of politics and talk about the rise of science denial, especially in COVID-19. I think that is also perhaps being used as ways to justify the defunding of science. And I think that is an added concern, especially now. So I'll just throw that out there. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Brandon.
I'll say that I don't know how COVID-19 will reshape the global science system. When I argue that there's a growing multipolarity in the global science system and global academic science, I don't mean to imply that old patterns are wiped away immediately, or that the system is equal, that everyone is able to participate in the same way, or that it's free of power dynamics. I simply mean that the singular dominant position of the United States is changing.
Thanks, Brendan. Thank you. And Wen, I think you've got the last.
Well, I don't have an answer to this question, but I do think it's a very good question. Well, I will just, actually, I hold a quite promising attitudes towards the international collaboration in the future, because like I will use Foucault's sentence to end my as a concluding remarks. Well, like knowledge or science can be embedded in power, but it always has the potential to spill out from under any structure that tries to hold it in. So I really echo Simon's remarks that most of the bottom-up research is driven by curiosity, not by money, not by political tension or political pressure. Is driven by curiosity. That's the nature of science. So based on this nature, based on the nature of science, I'm quite promising, towards the future. Yeah, although we have some temporary, geopolitical tensions.
Thanks, Wen, and thanks for the positive note, but I think I share your view. And I want to thank all three presenters. I mean, I think this is an outstanding webinar, as good as any we've had. And the YouTube video is going to be watched, I think, with interest by many people who weren't tuned in today. It was really great to have the three of you on. I want to thank Jenny particularly for the way she's opened up much of these issues for us, and she's been so vigorous in getting her analysis out there and inviting engagement in the discussion and creating a counter hegemonic and new view, I think, in the US of the US-China relationship. Very important contribution, but also Brendan and Wen today. I mean, what you think said was very, very helpful as well. Our next, I should just note that we did have more people on the question list. Manuel Cortez is waiting for a while, Chugui Jirac, Xin Shu, and I'm sorry I couldn't bring you in. We always feel frustrated at the end of a good discussion that we don't have 2 hours, but our webinar format seems to work well in the hour, so we stick to it. Colleagues, tomorrow we've got another webinar. This one is more UK focused, but it's about the passage of international students from China to the UK and what education agents in China are currently saying about mobility, about the attitude of families and students to mobility into the English-speaking countries. So an issue of great self-importance for UK higher education right now. How many Chinese students will we have in a few weeks' time? So I look forward to seeing you all those names in the participant list again tomorrow for that discussion of COVID-19 and the recruitment of Chinese international students in the UK and the views of agents. And also, once again, thank our three presenters, Jenny, Brendan, and Wen. Goodbye to all for now.